Welcome to the CMMC compliance webinar from Sabre Limited. We're going to talk today about the cybersecurity maturity model certification. Let me see, I got my clicker, but it's not working. My name's Rob Jolliffe. I'm the owner of Sabre Limited. Sabre is a manufacturing-oriented IT specialist company with offices in Canada and the US and staff basically all over the place, almost everywhere you can imagine. My background is mechanical engineering originally, but then after graduating from that, becoming a supply chain practitioner, working in purchasing and production scheduling, but then switching into IT in my mid 20s and learning ERP systems in particular. But I've also developed in parallel with that, a lot of our manufacturing customers need cybersecurity as a requirement of their customer base. So customers who are selling, for instance, to the pharmaceutical industry sometimes require cybersecurity minimum standards for their pharmaceutical customers. And so we've had to become experts in all of that. And I'm not the best expert in the whole company, but I'm probably the best generalist. So I think that is part of my magic skill. So a little bit about CMMC. CMMC is very much a defense industry oriented requirement. Just to give you an example of why this is coming into place is that there's the J-20, and I think the other one is the N-20, which are the stealth fighter and stealth bomber that China has developed. And from the research that people are doing, it looks like they literally were able to perform espionage, steal the information about how to build the plane based on the F-22 Raptor. And this is according to former U.S. military official, a guy named James Anderson, who's interviewed on Fox News. And you can find that on the defensepost.com. So what's happened is that the U.S. government and other governments around the world, now CMMC is U.S. based, but there are others in other countries, they're beginning to recognize that these incidences of cyber attacks against the supply chain are not just money-making issues. They're not, they're also there to steal information, steal intellectual property, some of which is U.S. government or defense contractor information, because a lot of manufacturing companies, you don't think they're necessarily making parts that go into these weapon systems and these defense systems, but they do. And so if they could get a little bit of information from everybody, they can kind of assemble the solution. They don't have to get the plans for the main F-22 Raptor. They can manage to find and break into all of the small subcontractors who make parts for it, or it could be for any kind of system that the U.S. government uses. It could even be for something the CDC is doing with vaccines, for instance. So the idea being that the U.S. government is concerned about this and is implementing CMMC. Originally, when they originally announced it a few years ago, they announced it was going to be 5 levels. It was going to be pretty complicated, but they've decided, we're just going to simplify this down to a 3-level requirement, level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 would be a requirement of businesses that have contracts with U.S. government or entities that have contracts with U.S. government. So if I'll give you an example, if you printed the labels for vaccines that the U.S. government then used those labels, or if you created tags and forms that were used by the U.S. government, you are technically part of a level 1, even if that item that you're producing in no way is secret or has information in it. But they just don't want people to know that you're doing business and you're producing those products. So level 1 is designed around that. It's just a self-assessment, annual affirmation. Yeah, we are doing these things. Very few requirements. And really, it's everything a company should be doing for their cyber hygiene. Like, these are the stuff you should just do. Level 2 is a lot more stringent. And level 2 requires the implementation of something called NIST 800-171. So NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I think. And it is a U.S. government agency that defines different standards for different types of things. Could be the standard of how much lead should be in certain types of glass when it's manufactured or something like that. Not from a safety point of view, but just like this is a standard way of making this safely, or with the correct characteristics. But in this case, what NIST has done is they've defined a standard for how cybersecurity should be done. And a level 2 needs to be assessed every 3 years by a formal assessment that they pay for. And then in between, they have to do reporting that they are maintaining that. And then that's for level 2. Level 3, I don't think we're going to have anybody doing level 3 that would come to this webinar. But if you are doing level 3, you're developing something and you have the plans to make a nuclear, your Raytheon or something, you're making a nuclear missile, Patriot missile system or something like that, that is super top secret, and you have some of that information and you have to adhere to extremely, extremely high levels. So level 2, you don't have top secret information, but you have information that they don't want their adversaries to get. And typically that's in the form of things like engineering drawings. So it's this, if you're handling engineering drawings, if you're handling information that's coming, there's a mark on it that indicates that it's something called a controlled unclassified information, CUI. And there'll be a little mark on it that indicates this is a CUI, and you have to keep that information confidential. And when you have that kind of data, that kind of those drawings or whatever it is, that's when you need to be the CMMC level 2. That's typically what we see. That's the kind of clients that we encounter that would need it. So basically, once you have CMMC fully implemented, and this is from the Department of Defense, once they've implemented this, those DoD contractors that handle that sensitive unclassified information will be required to achieve the level. So the CMMC isn't fully implemented. The US government has not completed the implementation of it. So there's time now. It goes until, I believe, next summer is the deadline. It has been moved around a little bit, so it could be that there's a bit of squishiness. The main contractors, like the prime guys, like the Boeings and McDonnell Douglas and Raytheon, and those people who are producing, to get really specific to the, aircraft kind of side, those guys are going to have it. No question. That's it. You're done. You're not doing business with them. But they're huge companies. They have lots of resources to do this. Their subcontract organizations, the organizations they contract to, are also going to need to have it. It's the third tier and fourth tier. When you get down into the contractors, at that point, that's going to, I believe, take a little longer to move out. But eventually it's going to happen that top tier is going to say to the next tier down, have you confirmed all your contractors have CMMC level 2 or whatever is required? And if they say, no, we haven't been able to, they're going to say, well, we're not going to do business with you. And that's going to cause a pressure to push down the supply chain until essentially everybody who's supplying anywhere in that chain is involved. And that's a lot of companies. That's tens of thousands of companies that are part of that supply chain. So that the compliance through self-assessments is for level 1, that's going to be good enough for clients. You just basically have to confirm, attest on some paperwork that you have done that, and you can apply for CMMC level 1, and you'll be CMMC level 1. Now, it's a crime to attest that you have it when you don't. So don't do that unless you've actually implemented level 1, and just bring somebody in who knows how cybersecurity is done correctly and make sure that's done. For level 2, you must have a triannual third-party assessment. So there's a third party that's going to come in and look at it. Now, we're Canadian. We have a lot of Canadian customers, and so there's been a question floating around, what about the CMMC in Canada? I personally have asked people in the controlled goods program, which is the equivalent to the US ITAR program in Canada, and said, what's going on with CMMC? And they haven't been able to help me. But doing a little bit more research, I found out there is a direction. So the government of Canada has announced a program they're calling the Canadian Program for Cybersecurity Certification. And the plan of this program is that once it's implemented, they are going to be seeking, or they're already seeking, a mutual recognition with the US as a CMMC equivalent. So Canada, you're not left out. It is moving forward. Pursue the CMMC because that's better defined, and the NIST 800 is internationally recognized standard for cybersecurity. Pursue that. and get that in place. There are other things you have to do, though. So CMMC is not just cybersecurity. It's more than that. So there's a percentage of it, a portion of CMMC that is what I'll call legal or administrative. And that part involves things like who, when, and why different people within your organization should have access, and policies written out that are developed. That background checks of those individuals are being done, that there's a proof of need. In other words, if somebody shouldn't have access to that data or that information, it's isolated. Now that's a little bit of IT, because the IT department will obviously set up the rules and the permissions of the groups of users, and be able to show through logging that only those people who were supposed to have access had access. But it's up to the business to decide who those people who have access are. And that has to be documented. You have to have policies for deletion. So if you're going to be deleting this data when it's no longer needed, you have to have policies. You have to be able to prove that you're deleting it. But these are done by people as opposed to IT. Background checks, the proof of need, all of these sorts of things are defined by your corporate governance, and that is not an IT department responsibility. IT will execute some of it, but they're not actually going to do it. So I would call that more almost like an HR or quality department related. It's not technical. It's policy based within your organization. I don't know anything about that. I apologize. There are organizations that know a lot about it, but that's kind of a big part of CMMC. Let's say that's 20% of CMMC. 80% of CMMC, though, is going to be NIST 800. So let's just look at NIST 800. This is tricky, and there's a lot to it. Think of it as, if you've heard of ISO 9000 or ISO 14000, it's similar to that level of complexity. And if you've ever gone through an ISO implementation, you understand that's a really, really painful effort. There is an ISO standard, the ISO 27000 standard, which we're going to be doing another session on, which mirrors the NIST 800. It's the, I'll call it the European version of NIST 800. If you pass an ISO 27000 audit, you're probably going to pass the CMMC, the technical side, the IT side of CMMC really easily. So if we look at the level 2, and we just isolate on it, there are 110 requirements aligned with the NIST 800 standard. That's a lot. And those requirements are everything from making sure that all elements of your business are using two-factor authentication. And that two-factor authentication might not even be an entire element. It might be part of an element. So the NIST 800 spec is pretty long. And what I did was I just went into it and I decided to go through it. So I found the NIST 800 spec online and I started browsing through it. So I'll just talk over it while you watch this thing go. But you could sort of see from the table of contents, it's a pretty big document. And I believe this document is about 110 pages long. So we have staff internally who are familiar with the NIST 800 standard, but even we aren't familiar with every single minutia of it. And it is a massive, massive document with a massive number of requirements that are essentially what the US government is today saying every business should be done. So here's a mapping table. So it goes through each element, and then in the far right edge of it, you'll see here that there's a little map. Here, let me stop it somewhere. Let it keep going for a second. Oh, got to the bottom of it. I don't know if I can, now I can't scroll up it. Unfortunately, it's a little pre-recorded video, but you'll see if you actually download it and you look at it, what you're going to see is the ISO 27001 standard is listed in it, and it has a mapping. It says this is the NIST version, this is the ISO 27000 version of the same thing. So that NIST and like I said, NIST and ISO 27000 are kind of like two sides of the same coin. Now, there's another standard, because this is so daunting. First of all, one thing I'm going to say is that the difficulty level is like on the same scale as doing an ISO 9000 or ISO 14000 certification. It's really not. It's not like in 3 weeks I can get NIST 800 implemented. That's a 1 year plus project to put it in. And companies who need it for CMMC who have not started now, you are way, way behind the curve. And there's a lot of those, tons of those. Okay. So taking this from some online information that I found, and for companies, first of all, you got to talk to your customers. Are you going to be required to be CMMC? Are the products that we provide for you related to that? That would be the first thing to have a conversation with the customers, and just make sure that you understand whether you'd even be affected by it. Also, are they supposed to be engaged in CMMC? Are they behind? Like, are they doing it and they haven't gotten around to telling you have to do it? This is going to be happening, I think, a lot, because those companies that need CMMC certification are really focused on themselves, and they may surprise their supply chain base and come out of nowhere and say, hey, oh, by the way, you need to be NIST 800 compliant and apply for CMMC. So step number 2 is understand if you have any of this confidential and classified information that I've been talking about. Typically, again, that conversation with your customers is going to be part of the ability to identify this. But typically, companies that are doing anything in which they need an ITAR certification are guaranteed to be at this level. And there may be companies out there that don't require that. They're kind of not formally in that program, and they don't need to be in that program, but it turns out they're going to need NIST level 1, or CMMC level 1, which is not the entire NIST standard. It's like a little subset of it. But the CMMC level 1 is going to be the 2-factor authentication I talked about before, having really good backups, training your employees regularly. It'll be everything, most of, if not all of, what your typical cyber insurance form today requires you to have. So find out if you have this CUI. You might not realize it, because you might not have ever had any communication from your customers that this is CUI. And CUI includes government contract information. So once again, if you are producing something that is ultimately used by the federal government, and you have the information about how many you're producing and when it's supposed to get to the customer, et cetera, or to the government, et cetera, that's CUI. That's classified or confidential and classified information. Now, if you have identified that you think you are in this ballpark, you do need this, there are different organizations you can reach out to. And I describe it as being like an ISO certification partner. So first of all, there are these registered practitioner organizations. They get that orange colored badge. And what the RPO is they are organizations that registered with CMMC, and they know how CMMC works. They basically demonstrate that they have a knowledge of the CMMC cybersecurity requirements. We are considering pursuing the Canadian version of this as soon as it's understood and available. The C3 PAO is the third party, certified third party practitioner organization or audit organization. And what they're able to do is they're able to come in and perform that audit I talked about that has to be done every 3 years. Now, there's also the US government themselves that will be doing an audit. They'll have their own internal auditing team that does the level 3 CMMC. But once again, I don't think any of the clients who would be interested in the services we talk about generally and might come to this webinar would fall into that category. So maybe around the same time you talk to these guys, I would almost argue this could be done slightly out of sync, is you could get a readiness assessment done of your cybersecurity readiness, and you can do the formal one, which is the supplier performance risk system assessment. That is the CMMC formal assessment. But a lot of IT companies, a lot of security companies will do an assessment comparing your readiness against NIST 800. You're essentially looking for the same thing. And if you have the NIST 800 list of requirements, the 110 requirements, and you're only satisfying 8 of them, then you are only about 8% of the way to what you need to be CMMC level 2. And that a lot of companies can do that. Sometimes they're relatively inexpensive. maybe $2,000. You can have that assessment and it'll tell you, and that'll give you a really good idea of where you need to go. Once you have an assessment done, it should give you a gap audit. It should give you a big list of everything that needs to be done and where you are in that list. And you need to address and correct those shortfalls. You have to go through that list and start knocking off all of the problems. And then finally, once you've reached that last step and you've knocked off all of them and you're ready to go, you call in and you ask for a certification. You pay for that. Somebody comes in, does the assessment of you. It's probably a multi-week process. They pick random samples of things. They double check to make sure that you've actually implemented the standard as required. You will most likely fail and receive minor and maybe some major infractions, and then you have a chance to address those, and then you come back in and show how you address them, and then if you've done it to their satisfaction, you'll be passed and you'll be CMMC. So one of the things in doing some of the research on this, I've been looking. I have a couple clients that are pursuing CMMC. And I've asked them for a bit of feedback. I didn't get it in time for this session, but what I've been hearing online is that this is becoming a competitive advantage. So there are businesses that have implemented part or all of CMMC, and they are now able to make sales and win contracts that their competitors can't win because the companies that they are dealing with are looking for this technology. So, get that cybersecurity audit done that I was talking about. If you really think this is an opportunity for your business, get that cybersecurity audit against NIST 800. Get the self-guided checklists and assessment tools. Now, what is this? There are companies out there that know the CMMC requirements, and what they've done is they've created basically Microsoft project-y sort of lists of tasks that are needed to complete CMMC that you could get and you can self-guide, or you can have, typically a lot of companies will get one of these tools and then have a consultant help them. And what it can do is it can interrogate your network. So it can reach in, you connect it into your network, you connect it into your cloud connections and stuff, and it'll go through and it'll do all the technical checks that it can, and it'll tell you, oh, you need to correct these things, and when you correct them, it'll mark them off. It'll put a green check mark beside them for you. Very cool tools. We've been looking into these for clients. We think this is a really, really great approach to use. And then just start investing in those minimum requirements, like the stuff you absolutely know you should be doing anyway, that are going to be required, so that you don't have as big a lift if you do decide to do it, or if you're in Canada and the standard hasn't been ratified yet, you're there. You've got a lot of the pieces in place. Just do a reality check. Make sure you know what it's going to require, and make sure you're ready. That's my recommendation. And that's the CMMC information session for now. Robbie, did we get any questions?
Yeah, thank you for that insight, Rob. So now it's time for the answers to the questions that have been asked. I'd like to start with this one question, which is, how long does it take to become CMMC compliant?
Well, okay, so that's a really big question.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one client we're working on right now, which is a mid-sized manufacturer, has been working on it for 18 months and has not completed it. They're doing it themselves, so there's a lot of internal resources who are assigned to it. Probably could have done it faster if they had contracted it out, and probably could have done it faster if they had decided that some of the cybersecurity, they would buy a third party to perform the cybersecurity. This is where CMMC is a little different than like an ISO 9000. In an ISO 9000, what you're doing is you're creating the processes for your own business, for your own staff to follow. In CMMC, though, you have to deploy cybersecurity best practices. There are a lot of companies out there that will act as your outside cybersecurity best practices provider, and you can kind of outsource that to them. Now, there's that 20% of CMMC that I talked about that's sort of more administrative. You can't outsource that. You have to do that. but you could technically bring in an outside party and pay them to just be your in-house IT cyber security team. And those businesses can come in and can shortcut it. But it's at least 6 months to a year, I would think, would be the shortest you could practically do it in, which is why I said it's coming next summer. People are running out of time. And there's a lot of companies that haven't even started.
Right.
I think we have time for one more question, Robbie. Is there another question?
Okay. So another question would be, what are the potential consequences of non-compliance with CMMC?
So if you're a business that relies on U.S. government Department of Defense contracts, you may lose those contracts. You may not be eligible to continue providing that product. Now, I've been in manufacturing a long time. I understand some of these products, there's not really anybody else who can make them. But what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with a situation where you're opening the door to a competitor to come in and figure out how to make the thing that you make and win that contract. Because if you are not pursuing CMMC and you don't plan on doing it, your customer, because typically in the supply chain, there's an end customer, U.S. government, and then there's a manufacturer makes the products for the U.S. government, and then they have subcontract manufacturers, and they have subcontract, et cetera, et cetera. It goes down multiple levels. If you're down closer to the bottom of those levels, you're making some specialty product that's a little bit hard to make, and it's not an enormous part of your business, you really have to decide whether it's worth it. Because CMMC is a multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars project, no matter how you look at it. You're not getting away with doing CMMC, even a relatively small company, unless you're spending probably a lot more on IT security than you are today if you're not pursuing, or if you're not ready for this. So there are going to be some companies that say, I only do $200,000 a year contracts, it's not worth it. But there are going to be companies that do $5 million a year. And you're going to have to take some of the profit from that, and you're going to have to reinvest it in CMMC, or you're going to lose it. It will go.